Okay, we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome and thank you everyone for joining us for this webinar. We have a series that we're pleased to be able to introduce, and we've been very fortunate for this one to have two very knowledgeable and relevant speakers on the subject of hydrogen. So the topic for this webinar is the decade of hydrogen, question mark, and exploring pathways to decarbonization and BC's competitive advantage. So with us today, we have Matthew Klippenstein, who is with the Canadian Hydrogen and Fuel Cell Association. And we have John Dalton, who is with Power Advisory. I'll just give you a little intro on both of them. So Matthew is Regional Manager, Western Canada for the association. His role is to help scale these technologies to assist with climate efforts in Canada and abroad. His professional experience includes fuel cells, renewables, consulting, and he administered and led outreach for the province's pioneering EV infrastructure rebates for apartments and workplaces. He hopes to help hydrogen create vigorous demand for renewables development across all regions of the province, years ahead of published projections. John Dalton is president of Power Authority, an energy sector-focused consulting firm. He has over 30 years of experience in energy market analysis, power procurement, and policy analysis and development. He's currently advising a client on alternative markets, including hydrogen and ammonia for proposed major BC electricity generating project. He appeared on behalf of Clean Energy BC and CanWIA on competitive renewable energy alternatives as part of the BC Utility Commission's inquiry respecting Site C. John is chair of the Business Network for Offshore Wind's Generation and Transmission Working Group. So I would like to thank both of you for joining us today. And I know there have been a lot of discussions about hydrogen globally, but we haven't really taken a look at this in terms of what this means for British Columbia. And so we're very fortunate to have these two speakers who have very relevant experience and I think some knowledge that will help us to understand what the future may hold for hydrogen in British Columbia. So thanks everyone again for joining us, and we'll turn over to our speakers now. We are going to stop halfway through for a brief Q&A, and then once the presentations are finished, then we will open it up to questions and answers. If you could please type in your questions in the Q&A box that you see below your screen, and we'll make sure that they get covered during this session, as long as we don't go over time. Thanks very much, and I'll turn it over.
All right then. I suppose I'm speaking now. Fantastic. Thank you very much for having me again. As Laureen noted, I'm Matthew Klippenstein with the Canadian Hydrogen and Fuel Cell Association. In a minute here, I'll just share my screen with you to go through this quick presentation. Should be under 20 minutes. If you have any questions, just let us know. You can also ask questions after the fact. And so yeah, just pardon me for a moment while I try to work this PowerPoint out. Oh, 1 second. There we go. All right, hopefully this is working now. I'm getting a little bit of a nod. Fantastic. So yes, thank you very much. This is a very introductory little slide deck for all of you. I'm trying to figure out how to provide the information about hydrogen, which is of most relevance to Clean Energy BC members. You'll be able to see how it goes. Again, I'm Matthew, Regional Manager for Western Canada for the Canadian Hydrogen Fuel Cell Association. In terms of an outline, oh, here we go. There we go. In terms of an outline, so want to say a little bit about hydrogen, BC's emissions profile. Perhaps hydrogen could help with some challenges that some members may be facing. Some talk about near-term and medium-term uses, and a little bit of information about the BC hydrogen strategy as well. That was published last year. So very first, high level on hydrogen and our association. Hydrogen has gotten a lot of attention recently, and the reason really is that until a few years ago, governments were talking about reducing emissions maybe 20% or 40%, or if they were really ambitious, maybe 60% from like 2007 or other levels. And in that context, you can do a lot, most of it, perhaps all of it, with just a build out of renewables and batteries for light duty vehicles. The challenge comes when you get more ambitious and when you aim for net zero. And when you aim for net zero, then hydrogen has a big, massive role to play. It's not really needed for incremental climate policy, but it's really the keystone for any policy, any credible plan to get to net zero. So that's kind of, it's the keystone from the little arch there. In terms of final energy demand, if you think of it as a lobster claw, the big part of the claw is going to be direct electrification. Using electricity directly, electricity such as the power that Clean Energy BC members generate to provide energy for the grid, to do some electrification of vehicles, especially lighter vehicles, as well as some displacement of fossil fuels in industry and so forth. What we have on the smaller edge of the lobster claw, we have clean hydrogen, low emissions hydrogen, being used either as a fuel, perhaps as a feedstock. And just along the side here, I've summarized the percentage of hydrogen as final use energy that is projected or modeled for a variety of countries. Bloomberg and New Energy Finance at the bottom projected up to 24% of final energy demand in 2050 would be hydrogen. So again, mostly direct electrification with hydrogen filling in the balance. Just to visually show hydrogen's many roles, it is a feedstock. It is used for fertilizer production, for example. It can be used to reduce iron, so one can make steel. It's also a feedstock in many refineries and plastics manufacturing. So it is a feedstock. It can be used in heat and power, especially for high temperature industrial heat. In Metro Vancouver, one of the, I believe in City of Vancouver, the largest point source of emissions is the district heating system, for example, in downtown Vancouver, uses natural gas. Perhaps hydrogen can be used to replace that. Direct electrification is a bit tricky, according to the people who run the utility. In Metro Vancouver, the cement plant, I think it's Lafarge Holcim, is the largest point source in Metro Vancouver. And instead of using natural gas, perhaps we can replace that with hydrogen. It can also be used to provide power and can be used in transportation, particularly on the heavier vehicle side. We'll get to that shortly. With respect to the Canadian Hydrogen Fuel Cell Association, we are a national organization. Admittedly, there are only about 6 of us, so nice to say you're national, but we're quite modest in size. We have about 160 members. We have provincial branches, which is to say boots on the ground in BC, that's me. We have a branch we're pulling together in Alberta, also branches in Ontario and Quebec, and we have an affiliated organization in Atlantic Canada for those 4 provinces there. The opportunity ultimately is that being that hydrogen will represent up to, I think, 30% of Canadian energy use in 2050, we have a great opportunity to scale up the clean hydrogen industry, with fuel cells as one of the use cases. In 2018, the estimate was that that was about a $200 million market. We can grow that, displacing fossil fuels in many comprehensive ways, to something which is on the order of 47 billion or 47,000 million dollars in the next 30 years or so, with massive increases in employment. This figure does not include export opportunities, which are being worked on. I guess John may even speak to that as well. So it's very much of a growth market. In Canada, at the federal level, we do have a hydrogen strategy. That's a little book icon there. And we have a variety of measures. I'll speak to those a little bit more, which will help in deploying hydrogen, even if generated from smaller facilities at first. Again, displace CO2 emissions in a variety of sectors. Here in BC in particular, we have a hydrogen strategy. We have a hydrogen hub in development, basically a node where we have lots of energy flows, which will gradually move towards hydrogen. And we also have a gas energy decarbonizing policy, which will be very effective in the near term in terms of providing a demand, a buyer of first resort, if you will, for hydrogen as we scale up other uses. One factor which will be important in the British Columbia context, Western Canada as well, is that many countries have a desire to import hydrogen to replace LNG or coal imports. I believe it's about 95% of Japan's primary energy use is imported. Korea, it's about 80%. India is about 50%. And so these are very large markets that British Columbians and the companies within British Columbia can help supply with safe, reliable, and geographic diversification, all things which are, I guess, even more acutely relevant today than even 2 years ago. I'll speak very quickly to the BC emissions profile. And this is roughly what it looks like. We're a little bit under 70 million tons per year, with goals of getting to, I believe it's 40% below current emissions by 2030, which is 38 million emissions from 2007 levels, and then gradually decreasing further to 2040 and 2050. In terms of the role hydrogen can play, the BC Hydrogen Strategy models that hydrogen will displace about 10% of the greenhouse gas emissions, mainly in transport, but not only in transport. So again, happy to speak with any of you at further length subsequent to this. My understanding, and I did help when I was with the Woods Renewables Group, of strategy is not even indifferent, is sort of disinterested even in receiving power from independent power producers because they forecast a surplus for a number of years. That is very terrible for the local renewables development sector. One way that hydrogen can help in this regard is that the development of export projects, a gigawatt scale project, for example, would significantly increase electricity demand. That would eat at BC Hydro's surplus and hopefully incentivize them to be more open to even existing renewables projects to which they have not expressed the most outgoing support, it seems. So that is one aspect. One aspect is that the role of hydrogen is to eat up some of that surplus, be able to transport it to Asia, where they can use it in place of fossil fuels, and also eat away at the surplus that BC Hydro is projecting, all of which would be good for Clean Energy BC members. A second aspect is that if BC Hydro is not properly valuing members' electrons, then it is possible to take those electrons and then run them through an electrolyzer, use these to generate hydrogen, where perhaps in the form of hydrogen, the energy can be better monetized, better utilized, better valued by Fortis in the near term, and in the medium term, as we go forward, by a variety of transport applications. So that's the other aspect. It's upvaluing the electrons that members may already be producing or may be planning to produce. In the near term, gas energy decarbonization is probably the biggest lever for the use of clean electricity here. The reason is that the government has created a market for a demand for low emissions gas energy with its renewable gas mandate. 15% of gas energy delivered in BC has to be renewable by 2030. This boosts demand for RNG, but also for hydrogen from electrolysis, which fits under this umbrella. The hydrogen that members could create would qualify for this. And FortisBC does have a standing offer for hydrogen produced in this manner. They can inject and blend it into their network. And because so much energy flows through their network, they don't have to worry for quite some time about maximizing what their pipes can handle. There is also, in the longer term, the mandate is for them to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions through the gas energy by almost 50% within the decade. They are also beginning studies on either retrofitting or twinning their existing gas energy network, natural gas-based, for hydrogen. I want to emphasize that no one's end game is to permanently be sending methane, natural gas, blended with some hydrogen through pipelines. That's not the end game, but it is a way, it's like a relatively infinite market in terms of current hydrogen production in BC, where we can sink production until other sources of demand come up. So I just want to emphasize that's not probably something you would think of initially, but it is an opportunity. Now, to be fair, the standing offer from FortisBC probably isn't the most economical for many members, but if you're able to sign a supply which tides you over until higher value applications and transport come to fruition, perhaps there's an opportunity there. And that's what we'll talk about here. So in the medium and longer term, the biggest opportunity in BC is to decarbonize the province by replacing transport greenhouse gas emissions. In bulk, most of this will be on the heavier duty vehicle side, not so much passenger cars, but delivery trucks, locomotives, in due course, marine and aviation as well, some mining vehicles too. So transport is very much a larger opportunity. You can see it's 60% of the hydrogen-related emissions reductions mapped out for the province, much large, 4 times as large as the opportunity for replacing natural gas. But it will take a little bit longer to spin up because now we have to get the stations in place, we have to get the fleets in place. So again, there's kind of a short-term, medium, and long-term kind of a play here. One last thing I want to mention is that the province's, BC's low carbon fuel standard basically creates another market for emissions reduction credits. And currently, the market is pricing at the order of 450 Canadian dollars per ton CO2. That's the value of the credit. When used to replace diesel, that's a price of about $6 per kilogram of hydrogen. This is if generated using grid equivalent electricity. One way to contextualize this is that the current price for hydrogen at the pumps that we have in Vancouver, we have 4 hydrogen stations now, we'll have about 18 in a couple of years' time. The hydrogen there is selling for about $13 per kilogram. So it does help with the economics there. Very quickly, just going on to transportation. So I was the first person a number of years ago to start tracking the Canadian electric vehicle market in 2013. So it's been awesome to see how that has developed. One way to think of the interplay between batteries, electricity and batteries, and hydrogen fuel cells is to think about how in nature, your small animals tend to have exoskeletons, everything from beetles up to like crabs. Larger animals tend to have interior skeletons. They're vertebrates, they have endoskeletons. And so anything, I guess, hummingbirds in the small end, you get to your like charismatic megafauna like lions, horses, whales. There's a similar dynamic for various reasons in the transport side, where the expectation is smaller vehicles will be dominated by batteries. It's wonderful. Larger vehicles will be dominated by hydrogen and fuel cells. So there will be some crossover as well, but that is kind of the analogy to use when thinking of where hydrogen is going to be used in transport going forward. As an example of this, So we do have quite a hydrogen fuel cell cluster in Canada, in BC, in fact. There are about 5,000 buses and trucks around the world powered by BC-based companies. I've got little maps here. There are many companies in the fuel cell and the OEM and the trucking side working on hydrogen fuel cell technologies. Just to underscore that, so I mentioned earlier that we have 4 hydrogen stations currently up in British Columbia. They serve light-duty vehicles. I worked on the EV access for apartments and condos and things of that sort. We had a plug-in hybrid before we could charge at home. There aren't many hydrogen stations currently in North America, or the world particularly, but this map will fill out further as time goes on. So just wanted to make a quick note of that. And finally, I just want to close a little bit with the BC Hydrogen Strategy and how the initiatives there kind of tie to the interests that Clean Energy BC members may have. I won't go through this, a bit of an eye chart, but ultimately, starting with the province's goal to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, that brings us to the need to scale up clean hydrogen production, much of which will be met by, perhaps all in the BC case, by scaling up renewables development, which should hopefully be very good for Clean Energy BC members. I'll just close with this light-hearted spoof of the MasterCard commercial from way back in the day. Absolutely, any questions? Happy to try and answer them, and you can follow up with me afterwards at the email address below. I will now try to successfully end this slideshow and go back to the normal camera, but I'm not too sure if I'm going to be successful with that. Here we go. There we go.
That's great. Thank you, Matthew. That was very interesting and engaging. So we do have a few questions specifically for you. And I think we can try to let people ask them. Let's try it anyway. If not, then I'll just read the questions that they've submitted. So Richard, if you would like to pose your question, I think we can unmute you and allow you to ask your.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah. Yeah. So I had a question just with respect to the slide that you shared about integrating hydrogen into the existing natural gas infrastructure. And I was just curious, up to what percentage like the existing natural gas could be diluted, without having to kind of change things out, like boilers and pipelines and that sort of thing.
Right. So as of a couple of years ago, Fortis and the other utilities like Pacific Northwest Gas had actually bought every model of every end-use natural gas appliance in the market and found that all but one operated smoothly and functionally perfectly well, up to 10% hydrogen. The pipelines can take a bit more than that. There will be a mix of dedicated, probably industrial customers switching from natural gas to 100% hydrogen, generated locally or wherever. But in the fullness of time, well, in a few decades, not the fullness of time, there will be a need for a 100% hydrogen compatible pipeline, whether that is twinned or whether that is just a retrofit of the entire thing. There is a comprehensive study that is in evolution at the moment, where every pipeline segment in BC, from the big massive pipelines to the distribution, is going to be census taken, basically, to estimate the cost and figure out the best way of doing that, preferably without sending natural gas prices through the roof.
Thank you. Just as a follow-up, you talked about, I know the central steam plant in downtown Vancouver's natural gas.
Yeah.
If retrofitting that at a scale that would allow the financing to work, would there be any, like, I know hydrogen burns at a much higher temperature. In terms of air quality, local air quality, is there any issues surrounding that?
I don't believe there would be air quality impairments from combusting hydrogen. In speaking with Creative Energy, if I remember correctly, their current turbines can handle 30% hydrogen. For CapEx reasons, and I was asking, could you not just use boilers everywhere? Their energy use goes up by a factor of 10 from spring to winter. And so it isn't possible to directly electrify everything. The goal would be to ensure that however it's delivered, with hydrogen most likely, the balance of this does not produce emissions. If it's possible to use fuel cells, which don't use combustion, so much the better.
Great, thank you.
Okay, got just a few more minutes in here. Lauren, do you want to ask your questions in person?
Oh, I can see the question here. Oh, yes.
I have two questions. First, the substantial increase in hydrogen use for the transportation sector, is that for combustion or to convert to electricity for EV type vehicles?
Transportation, almost all of the focus is on fuel cells, so a non-combustion transformation of the chemical engineering the hydrogen into electricity. So in that sense, a bit like an EV, it is an electric vehicle of a sort. In the near term, when Alberta thinks about changing over from coal and natural gas, that is likely to be large gas turbines, which are compatible with 100% hydrogen. So yeah, in the transport side, non-combustion is what the thinking is.
And the second question, for use of hydrogen for electricity generation, what is the cost currently on a per kilowatt hour basis to take hydrogen, and convert it to electricity? How many dollars per megawatt hour or per kilowatt hour would that be roughly?
Okay, so that's going to depend on a lot of factors.
Yes.
There's the capex of the facility and others. There is high temperature fuel cells, for example, solid oxide fuel cells, which can run on natural gas today, and you basically pull out one module and they can run on straight hydrogen. Those tend to be much higher than current BC rates. But because of Canada's seasonal need for energy, we will always need some sort of a gas energy in the winter to supplement we are allowed to use it. And you pay residential.
Sorry, Matthew, you
Oh, did I freeze? I'm so sorry.
It was out just a bit at the end there.
Okay, so yes, it will be more expensive, but we will need it for seasonal shifting to replace the role that natural gas plays today. So yeah, there's a non-answer answer for you.
Thank you.
Okay, so I think what we'll do is we have some more questions here, but we'll.
Okay, I can just type away at them or something like that, maybe.
Yeah, or we can hold them as well until after John has spoken and
Sure.
come back to the questions at that point.
Sure.
Great. Okay. Thank you very much, Matthew.
Thank you.
John, would you like to go ahead?
Certainly. There we go. Well, thank you for the opportunity to share some thoughts here. Before I start, I really just want to provide an appropriate caveat. Unlike Matthew, I am not a hydrogen expert. I'm a electricity energy markets expert. I think the good news from my perspective is that electricity is, a critical input and key determinant of the ability of BC to compete as a green hydrogen hub. And that really is going to be a lot of the focus of what I'm going to present on today. And here really is an overview, kind of what is a hydrogen hub? Why do we need hubs? provide a little bit of perspective in terms of future green hydrogen demand and what could that mean for market opportunities. And then really delve into some of the focus of my presentations. What would be the requirements for BC to compete as a hydrogen hub? And the preview is they're good. I think that BC is well positioned to serve in this role. And as part of that, really focusing on some of BC's competitive advantages. And then finally, one slide really just providing some, thoughts on a policy focus. And it really aligns with some of the work that's already underway. So moving on in terms of, what are the attributes required for a hydrogen hub? Essentially what we're talking about as a hub is it's really a supply-demand balancing point. It's a point where buyers and sellers effectively come together to trade. And, for examples, we have here in the US, the Henry Hub, which is kind of the preeminent, natural gas trading point in North America. Closer to home in BC would be Sumas, the gas trading point at the BC-Washington border. And for the electricity markets, there's Mid-Columbia, which is essentially the trading hub for the Pacific Northwest. So what are the key characteristics of a hub? Essentially it's a lot of it is infrastructure, and essentially the ability of buyers and sellers to take delivery at that point. So that's one thing that's critical. So what does this mean for green hydrogen? It's going to probably largely involve pipelines, ports, as well as ideally some storage capability. And these are all infrastructure that BC does have. The defining thing of a hub really are many buyers and sellers. And this is essential in terms of to ensure liquidity, and liquidity, and I kind of get into this more in terms of the next slide. The other thing that I think that's important to recognize in terms of BC's source of competitive advantage here is BC's hydrogen cluster, and that's something that Matthew talked about in terms of all the fuel cell activity here, and that's an important important source of competitive advantage. There's a lot of capability here that will help BC to compete. So what are the benefits that we see from a market hub? Essentially, the liquidity that I mentioned that was so critical, it reduced market risks for buyers and sellers. When you do have liquidity, from a market perspective, it means that the price that the buyer is looking for, there isn't a huge variance from the price that the seller is willing to offer. I mean, obviously there can't be much of a variance. So what we're talking about is kind of narrow bid-ask spreads. One other benefit we see is, price transparency. We can see kind of what people are trading for. This is all important because it provides, a key condition to, support investment. So you can have essentially a virtuous cycle here, as the hub develops, and you have the benefit of parties being able to potentially go to Vancouver to trade hydrogen. It causes other parties to be interested in terms of making sure that they have access to this hub, and that would include, suppliers. That's going to include buyers, and that's really why people focus in terms of hydrogen hubs. So turning first to the demand side of the equation, the first place to look, obviously, is Canada. I think it's just appropriate to recognize that Canada's national hydrogen strategy does suggest 30% of energy use by 2030. Very ambitious target. I think that a very real nearby market is California. California obviously has leading clean energy ambitions. And what I have here is essentially results from a 2020 study done by the California Energy Commission, where this is their mid-case scenario. They put forward a 2035 demand of 0.3 million metric tons per year and a 2040 demand of 1.8 million metric tons per year. To the right, I have the aggregate demand in 2050, one forecast for Asia as well as California. And Asia really is the big market. And as everyone's probably aware, BC is pretty well positioned to serve Asian markets. So the aggregate demand that we're talking about there is effectively 98.5 million metric tons. And as the electricity market guy, it helps me to frame this in terms of electricity demand. And that's something that Matthew was talking about in terms of hydrogen as a way to kind of absorb some of the surplus that we see in BC, and which is likely to be exacerbated when Site C comes online. But this level, 98.5 million metric tons, is equivalent to 4,000 terawatt hours. And to put this in context, this is about 100 times what BC Hydro's annual energy production is. So if BC were to just get a 10% share of this market, this would represent, essentially a 10 times increase in terms of electricity requirements, assuming that, it's going to be electrolysis that's going to produce this hydrogen. So this is a very large market, major market opportunity. This next slide really just helps in terms of kind of framing the question for me. This essentially is some analysis that was done by the IEA, looking at the cost of hydrogen. That's essentially the left axis. You can see US dollars per kilogram. And the first graph really looks at what's the cost at different costs for electrolyzers. And electrolyzers is the technology that's being evaluated here. And as you can see, the interesting thing is that electrolyzer costs, as you get to high utilization, really isn't a significant cost driver. And as you move to the rightmost graph, that's really the focus here is what are electricity prices? And if you're assuming a cost for an electrolyzer of 450 US dollars per kilowatt, what are different cost of hydrogen? Generally, the benchmark that people use for electricity, competitive electricity input pricing is somewhere in the neighborhood of about, $40 a megawatt hour. But so this really just shows in terms of the critical role that electricity has to play in terms of allowing a jurisdiction to compete as a supplier of green hydrogen. So what is BC's competitive advantage? From my perspective, it really is, it's pretty simple. It's kind of your renewable energy mix. The fact that right now, the system is essentially fully decarbonized. You have the benefit of a very flexible hydroelectric fleet. This is, BC's storage capability, BC Hydro storage capability. That's very helpful in that if you are going to have to scale up renewable energy production, and it's not going to necessarily be from hydroelectric facilities, it's probably going to be from, onshore wind resources and ultimately very likely offshore wind resources. Then you're going to have the capability to store this surplus renewable production. Essentially, obviously, as the previous slide showed, a steady and high utilizations of electrolyzers, drives down the cost and further enables you to compete. So that's, one of the benefits that BC has is this storage capability offered by BC Hydro. The other thing is, this is one of the points that Matthew was making was, the energy surplus. And this is a view of the energy surplus, BC Hydro's energy surplus from a seasonal perspective. And I think it's important to point out that the difference here, essentially, the dotted line is the monthly energy demand, and the blue line is the energy input, essentially inflows into the system. The hydro reservoirs are there to essentially manage this, but in years where there's significantly greater water inflows, there's a greater potential for spills, or alternatively for selling it in export markets at prices, frankly, that don't really capture the full value of that energy. So, this surplus, the seasonal surplus, as well as the production from other renewable energy resources, onshore wind, as I said, probably longer term offshore wind, really represents, a source of potential competitive advantage, particularly when one looks at the prices that BC Hydro is probably going to be able to get in these in export markets during this period, recognizing that the Pacific Northwest is probably going to be surplus at the very same time. One of the fair questions to ask is, what about the desert Southwest? The cost of producing solar there is very low. So can BC, compete with solar projects that are developed in the Southwest? And my rough gut answer, is yes. Essentially, what we're seeing is with this high volume of solar, it's basically flowing through, given the fact that the Pacific energy markets are quite highly integrated. So this graph here, essentially, it's really illustrative, but it gives you a sense in terms of the daily price profile. And this is what people sometimes refer to as the duck curve. And what essentially reflects is when solar resources become available at 8 and 9 o'clock in the morning, prices decline markedly. The good news is that because BC is interconnected to this broader electricity market, there's ability for BC to kind of capture some of these price reductions and use it. So the idea in terms of how one's going to be sourcing electricity from an electrolyzer located in BC is that it's probably going to be very much a portfolio approach, and there will be the ability to kind of access lower cost energy from the desert Southwest and use that as a way to make sure that BC continues to is able to compete. The other thing that I think it's important to mention in terms of when looking at the desert Southwest as a potential market competitor is, solar resources do not have the same capacity factors, right? They're producing during daylight hours. Their production comes off a little bit in the winter. So the output profiles of these resources, are lower. And recall the graph that we had, you want to be using that electrolyzer as much as you can to ensure that you're going to be able to source competitively priced green hydrogen. So the fact that you're going to be able to get a 25 or 30% capacity factor off a solar facility, you're probably going to need storage to really be able to use that electrolyzer at a level that you want. And when you do that, you're layering in an additional cost. The other thing that I think something to think about is it's the desert Southwest. And it's my understanding that you need about 6 or 7 gallons of water for every kilogram of hydrogen. So that's not a constraint in BC. I think it's very much going to be a constraint in terms of the desert Southwest. The one thing that does warrant considering, though, is the U.S. is very interested in terms of, capitalizing on the hydrogen opportunity. The recent, federal legislation in terms of the infrastructure bill authorized $8 billion for a variety of clean energy hydrogen hubs, not green energy, not green hydrogen hubs, clean. So I think that that's a point of differentiation, but green is subsumed within the definition of clean. But it is an indication that the U.S. is very interested in terms of making sure that there is development activity that's going to support this opportunity in the U.S. One thing it's just important to, this is kind of a non sequitur slide, but I mentioned the importance of storage. It's kind of something I think you need to check off. There are storage resources in BC. Two that we have here, natural gas fields and saline aquifers. Essentially, that allows high deliverability. If you remove the saline, and those are, the issue is you'd want those, close to the production market area. But that's basically just incremental infrastructure investment, and obviously those natural gas fields are going to be tied to gas pipelines. So that does essentially mean that there will be some infrastructure in place that would be available. A couple thoughts in terms of, said I would weigh in and provide on policy. I look at it in terms of two dimensions for policy. Do we want to, does it make sense to support the supply side, or does it make sense to support the demand side? Supply is, interesting in terms of technologies. My perspective is that from a policy support perspective, technology is very dynamic. The dollars required are large. I think that, and ultimately, at the end of the day, the technology is portable. Obviously, this is a source of competitive advantage in BC. So I'm not saying it isn't something that shouldn't be considered, but it's riskier. The stakes are higher. The payoffs are very compelling, though. And then, my perspective, supporting demand is permanent, and demand is obviously the other side of the equation. And just recognizing the fact that there is a low carbon fuel standard. Matthew talked a little bit about Fortis's standing offer. Those are good policy levers for supporting demand development. Another element of it is kind of just developing the underlying infrastructure. Quick summary here. BC has, many, I think virtually all the attributes required for a hydrogen hub. We see this in terms of the available infrastructure, ports, pipelines, ready access to major markets, California as well as Asia, availability of low-cost electricity, and I think lots of intellectual capital to bring to bear. Policy focus, to me, I view demand development as lower risk, but I think that the supply side represents some interesting opportunities. Based on my knowledge, I'm not really in a position to kind of weigh in terms of what technologies should be favored. And with that, I look forward to everyone's questions. Thank you.
Thank you, John. That was very interesting. Okay, so I think what we'll do now is we do have some questions on the board. I'm going to just go ahead and ask the first one for Richard. So he's asking, is the H2 available at existing stations in BC considered green?
Sure, I guess I can answer that. And so, with the exception of cases where the electrolyzers go down, all of the hydrogen at the hydrogen stations is from electrolysis. It's green, to use the parlance. Last calendar year, 2021, I think it was above 90% was green, with the remainder only used when the equipment went down and we had to bring in some gray hydrogen from California.
Okay. Thank you. Paul, do you want to go ahead and ask your question about pricing relative to gasoline?
Sure, I'm happy to, if you can hear me okay. Yeah, I'm looking at it from end user point of view right now. I guess I look at battery EVs as kind of the compact fluorescent light bulbs. They're okay, but you know the LEDs are coming, and that's hydrogen in the future for vehicles. Right now, though, a kilogram of hydrogen seems to run a car in the Mirai about as far as 7 liters of gasoline, which is equivalent to about 15 kilowatt hours for a battery EV. When you price those things out, you know, gasoline's a little bit less than hydrogen, but it's going to climb and eclipse hydrogen. Electricity on the grid in BC at tier 2, we're paying 12 cents a kilowatt hour. That's only $1.80 to go the same distance that $13 of hydrogen would take you. How do we change that and get that gap down?
Sure. So the gap will come down. One way to think of the hydrogen supply right now is that it's like artisanal. It's very small scale, similar to what John was showing. As production scales up, that will come down. Now on the passenger car side, yeah, like the beautiful thing with batteries is that 90% of what you're getting from your charger winds up as forward motion. With hydrogen, you get about half of it as forward motion, actually about close to 2/3 now as forward motion. So on a cost dollars per kilometer basis, you will be cheaper on the battery side. What's interesting or what's useful on the heavy duty transport side, where hydrogen does get more of an advantage, is that the cost of scaling up and fast charging, like long haul trucks, your costs of infrastructure scale up very quickly. And so you're not, unless you're leaving your capital equipment resting, hibernating for 12 hours a day, you are paying a much higher rate for your electricity. And in these situations, then the hydrogen does become competitive. So sorry, maybe that's kind of the direction you're pointing to, but yeah, I mean, with efficiency, you can't beat an e-bike, but then, we accept BEVs, which is awesome. Hydrogen, it's a little bit less energy efficient as well.
Maybe to add a little bit to what Matthew said, and he really is the expert here, but my understanding is that you can get a 70% reduction in CapEx when you move from a 2 megawatt to a 1 gigawatt project. So there are significant economies of scale here. Remember that CapEx is only about, from my perspective, my understanding, about 20% of the total cost, but bigger's better here. So as you scale up, costs are going to come down.
Right. Maybe just to add to that, yes. So CapEx, John had a chart on the cost sensitivity to CapEx for electrolyzers. Right now, in the year 2021, Chinese vendors were quoting prices of US $300 per kilowatt, which is basically at the bottom of those sets of curves. When they get standardized for Western standards, they'll be a little more expensive. They're talking 400. But again, there's a difference between going from something which is at the very earliest stages to something further. A little bit like the battery cost declines that we've seen, which are awesome. So yes, there are great opportunities. We're entering that phase where we get that 90% cost decline from a few years ago. Not for the retail price, mind you, but on the cost of production on the hydrogen side, which is great for the clean hydrogen. Sorry.
Thanks.
So we've got two questions from Syed. I think the first is for Matthew and the second one is for John. Syed, do you want to go ahead and ask them, or I can ask them for you?
Hello, is my voice clear?
Yes.
Well, thanks. Amazing presentation with great information. I was wondering if we scale up and hydrogen fuel-based energy is so attractive. By now, what is the major limiting factor? What is stopping it widespread movement in this sector? The second question is also quite relatable, and there is geopolitics involved. And as of now, major countries, USA, Russia, and Middle Eastern countries, they are the largest producers of oil and gas, hydrogen, hydrocarbon-based economy. What geopolitical factors? Because if you move to this kind of technology, that industry is going to completely go down.
Right. On the hydrogen fuel cell side, the limiting factor is actual scale of production. So we don't have the figures for 2021 yet, but if you totaled all of the fuel cell production in the entire world in the year 2020, that is the equivalent of about 10,000 vehicles. So of course, they're nowhere as big as batteries are yet because it's still very small. Now that amount is scaling up very quickly, similar to battery production growth. But that is the main reason that hydrogen fuel cells aren't everywhere yet. It's just you're starting small. It's like solar versus wind in like 1999 or something. The second question, the geopolitics are of course more important. We've learned a lot about that. One advantage we have, so there are going to be very low cost sources of hydrogen in Australia, in the Middle East, feeding Europe, feeding East Asia. One advantage we have, and perhaps Chile as well, is our shipping routes do not go through, I think it's the Singapore Straits. There are a couple really key crucial shipping lanes, which if they get disrupted, and Murphy's Law says that they will get disrupted someday, even if BC is marginally more expensive than another source, a Japan, a Korea, a China would want to have the ability to get some of their fuel from a region which can't be choked off. So that is one of the geopolitical aspects, like you're talking about, which will be emphasizing the need for geographic diversity of supply. Otherwise, you just get a similar kind of a, one crisis point blows up. One crisis point messes everything up that we don't want to repeat.
Thank you very much.
John, did you have anything to add to that?
No, I don't have anything to add. Thank you.
Okay. I'm going to just kind of bundle a couple of questions. We're getting short on time here. So we've got some questions about, in terms of BC's policies and regulations and what we're setting out to accomplish. What's the relative mix of emphasis on blue and green hydrogen? And, what do other things like the carbon tax and other policies contribute to this in terms of looking at hydrogen specifically?
Sure. I don't want to be the guy mansplaining things that John probably wants to speak to, so no, okay. I'm trying to be polite. Okay, so one of the...
Can you mansplain a man?
In BC, the government and our association is agnostic on whatever the color of hydrogen is. Ultimately, it has to be low emissions. If it's slightly higher emissions, when it's derived from fossil fuels of CO2 emissions with CO2 reduction, then that will be reflected in the actual price of the hydrogen itself. One concern about saying only green hydrogen, only hydrogen from electrolysis, is actually a little bit similar to what maybe is bedeviling Clean Energy BC members now, which is, can you scale up fast enough to meet all the demand you need, given geography, infrastructure is never popular, it seems. And so the BC government's approach is to allow everything and then allow the emissions intensity, including fugitive methane, to establish what is more viable in the market. We don't want to have a case where in one decade, BC Hydro's like, we don't need energy. And then the next decade, BC or the government is like, we need more than we can actually build. So, yeah. Oh, there's a follow-up question in there, but I've forgotten what it is already. Sorry.
Let me see here. Yeah, it's just asking about if BC regulations are set up to recognize the benefits of hydrogen.
Yeah. Okay. Yes. So they are. I'm always happy to get more help, but the government has been quite forward on the leading side of things. things have to be done right, mind you. So I can understand if the government has certain plans in place, but needs to make sure that no stakeholders get bulldozed in the efforts to scale things up. So broadly speaking, yeah, good marks, I guess I'd say.
Okay. Well, I think we're just a minute over time now. John, did you have anything else you wanted to add?
No, I just appreciate the opportunity to kind of participate. Thank you.
On the questions, like I'm happy to try and type out answers. Will they be saved somewhere so I can access them later this afternoon or something? Get back to the people who've asked them.
Yes, we can do that for sure.
Super.
Great. Okay. Well, I want to thank you both, Matthew and John. That was very interesting and I think enlightening. It's been a subject that's sort of been out there, and it's obviously part of a very complex kind of space. So we really appreciate that you've kind of laid out the major factors and what in particular in BC we should be considering. So I want to thank you for making the time to share that with us. We really appreciate it.
Thank you very much for having us.
Okay.
Thank you.
We'll close off now. Thanks again. Have a good rest of the day.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.